Jen, any questions you've got on where Reg and I are going and where's it all fitting?
Sure. I'm trying to think of when I asked that question. I'm
Oh,
trying to fix it.
oh,
Um,
goes back probably 4 to 6 weeks.
oh dear.
Yeah.
Okay. Uh, um, let's see. I can't.
Okay.
I can't think of it. I guess for me, yeah, that it'd be great to have an update on. I've noticed that you've been doing quite a bit of work on putting. It looks like educational
Right. Right.
material
Yeah.
together to kind of help people go through introductory.
Right. Right now, Reg is working on a much longer paper, and I'm meeting with him on Tuesdays on that, which gets into different types of power and the informal organization and how to view the informal organization maybe a little different. Uh, Generally, the informal organization is everything that's not the formal organization, but there's different types of networks, and within the informal organization, there's different purposes for how some of those networks form. So he's putting that together. We should have that ready for some broader discussion uh, pretty quick. It's coming together well. Part of that also, though, gets into an analysis of powers. We get into a lot in the past on positional power versus personal power. This looks at a little bit different. Positional power and personal powers are both related to the individual, what they bring to the organization or where they are positioned in the organization formally. But when you start getting collaboration, something starts to happen that's a little bit different. This is kind of the 2 + 2 = 5. Well, what's that difference? We always talk about the sum being more than the whole. When you look at all the individual parts, and we're coming to kind of a position where that difference is something that emerges out of the collaboration itself. And that when you put people together into a group, it's more than a number of individuals working together. Something different is happening, which we're starting to think about as collaboration power. Yep. This is somewhat similar to what Peter Block does with his community and organizing. He talks about the power of convening, and that a lot of times, if you're in the right place and the right time, you have enormous power just by being able to call people together. And to a large extent, that's built into the purpose alignment team. They have great power of convening because they can see an issue and pull people together to address that issue. That is power that would otherwise not be realized in an organization. We're coming at it from that perspective. I could also go through what I'm doing, which is taking a large body of knowledge, which has been basically captured in a series of webinars over the last 2 years, as well as a number of articles that Reg and I have written individually or collectively. And I'm trying to put it into a package that makes a little bit more sense, trying to keep one concept per page so that people can grasp one idea without getting too bogged down, trying to get it so that they can look at each one as a somewhat of a standalone, but have hyperlinks to other adjacent information, but being able to jump around the content without having to linearly go through one section after another. So it's obviously going to be built in a linear table of contents, but the way that people transport themselves through that knowledge can be very different depending upon where their interest lies and which links they choose to pick. So I can go through that. But before I do, let me open up to both of you. Is there anything that you wanted to address before I get into the table of contents and that layout?
No,
Not for me. Sorry, Jen.
no, that's okay. No,
Okay.
I don't have a set agenda. Not at all.
Okay, let me go ahead and pull that up then. Find it here. Okay, you should now be seeing the table of contents surviving the change to Tsunami. Okay, now you've got access to this already, but what you see here is my view of it, which has a number of things that are not yet published. So for example, on the preface here, the about the authors, about the ebook, those are published right now. But these down here that have the null sign, that indicates that it's an editing process, but it's not yet been published for review. So these two are basically templates that I use, so I can just duplicate the template. The supplemental reading is an approach to try to pull in some of the bigger articles for a deeper dive. A lot of times they get kind of off to the side and we're trying to figure out how to pull them in, but not make them front and center. So we're putting them into separate sections called supplemental reading for each individual chapter. The template is basically a standardized template for each individual module within the chapters that I can use and edit through a duplication process. So that I'll just come over here and I could duplicate the module and it will shortly be duplicated. And then I can go ahead and just drag and drop it down below. So I've got a new one right now as a copy. When I take a look into the template itself, I'm trying to put together some consistency. So I've got a title, and then I'm leading off with a JPEG, and I'm using basically a large JPEG because it's easy to display, particularly on Facebook and LinkedIn where I'm doing discussions. And I can bring them up real easy just by inserting a single image here. Then following that would be any MP4s from webinars. I've got a large number of webinars over the last few years, some of which have been chunked into individual topics. Others can be broken up some more to the extent that they're broken up and they fit within a particular concept here. I can link them. So I'll start off with a simple image followed by the MP4, which would go into a little bit more of that image. Then links. This is where I can hyperlink to content that comes before it or after it, depending upon the relationship of that content, so that people can linearly go through the table of contents, but they could also use the links to jump. If something doesn't make sense, they could jump back or they could jump forward into other next topics. Then I'm also including a PDF of the slide itself instead of the JPEG. This would give people an ability to capture it as a PDF, 8.5 by 11, and not just the image itself. It's a little bit more flexible in many ways. And then following that by references. And the references have to be here because they don't neatly fit within the images themselves, but I got to capture them. So to the extent that there's any references, I can go ahead and capture them here. And in some cases, those references might be in the supplemental reading, in which case I'll hyperlink to those. Okay.
Josh, did you create that template, or is that something that
that's a template. That's a template I created and will continue to evolve as necessary.
Oh, great.
You have a question on it or a suggestion?
No, not at all. I was just curious if it was provided by Mighty Networks or if you created it.
No, it's pretty easy to create. It's just that once I created it, it's easier for me to go ahead and duplicate that so that I can use that as a starting point versus starting from scratch every time.
Yeah, that's really smart. Yeah.
Okay. And let me kind of collapse things down here a little bit. I can see the full view. Okay, this is the tentative chapter structure. Okay, see if I wanted to start off with a blank one, I just do a plus here. That just adds a blank module with nothing versus a template. If I want to add another chapter, I just add a section here. So what I've got here is the preface that you saw just a few minutes ago, which is basically about the book, what we're trying to accomplish. And what you've been seeing is the Rethinking Organizations and Change. It's really the introduction. And this is where I've got 4 published already: the challenges we face, the requirements for the new organization, the paradox, the rethinking organizational change. Those have already been vetted not only on the Futocracy network, but also in some discussion groups I have on LinkedIn and Facebook. And what I'm doing there is I'm basically using this working group as a first pass, then publish them on Futocracy network and then elsewhere. And in each stage, basically crowdsource to figure out where people are having difficulties. Sometimes the feedback is almost too detailed. They're trying to jump too far. So for example, if you've been following some of Gary Wong's comments, he's seeing some minor inconsistencies, but he's seeing it within his framework of complexity science. And he would like to see levels of detail that goes far, far beyond what I can accomplish as an introduction. So, but he's bringing up some good. Malcolm at the same time sometimes gets in the weeds on terminology. So for example, the last one he brought up was the difference between continual and continuous change. And I'm not sure I quite understand that distinction, so I threw that one back to him. But in many cases, there's been some good feedback. So for example, some of the recent feedback I've been getting on whether it's episodic, how to put episodic in there. Disrupted stability caused some problems. So I kind of reworded that a little bit to be more meaningful as what we're trying to say. So it's basically a crowdsourcing to figure out where people are struggling with the concepts or the wording involved, to make it as clear as possible to as many people as possible, but at the same time, keep it simple, because I'm placing a constraint on myself that it's got to be simple enough to present on one page, ideally through bullet points or graphical images. And that I don't want it to have it be too complicated to require supplemental information or a great amount of prior knowledge at each individual point. If there's lacking of that prior knowledge, it's easily accomplished through the links. Okay. What I've got right now, for example, the evolving the change frameworks, that's being discussed right now. And that's where Gary and Malcolm are jumping all over. But again, in both cases, I think they're almost getting too detailed to try to look at it from everything that they know relative to an introductory slide. So they're giving interesting feedback, but I'm not sure how much of it I could use as at this level. Change as a business model I'm working on now. And after that, I'll be facing a change or a design problem that we've addressed in the past. And then let me open up supplemental reading. Okay, supplemental reading allows people to go deeper. So for example, the challenge we face, I've got a hyperlink here to the PDF that is that particular paper itself. The paradox that I summarized, well, behind that summary in one slide, there's actually an article that they can read for further. And same with the requirements for new era change framework. There's an article there. There's actually at least one webinar too I can parse up into parts. But again, this is where I'm trying to capture some of the critical information through the PDF for people who want to go a little bit deeper. In some cases, the deeper brings in other tangential information that I really have cut to try to keep it simple on the one page. Okay, and let me collapse this to give you a better flow. Okay.
Russ, I have a quick question. Who's your audience for this? Is it anyone who's just new to the Futocracy concept, regardless of their change management experience?
We want to hit a broader audience of really, I guess if I were to capture, I'd call them the inadvertent change managers. the people that are forced to do change to be successful in their jobs, those that are struggling with bureaucracy, that need a better way of approaching work. I'm trying to keep it to a general audience, and to a secondary audience in would be the people that's primarily in Futocracy Network right now, which are internal or external change consultants or educators. That's the dominant audience we have within the network. But I'm trying to make this broader, but at the same time, make it understandable that the other consultants that are already working in the area of organizational change can use it in their practice.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So it's really just for anyone who's in an organization dealing with change.
Right. Yeah. We're trying to hit the broad audience, because again, if change is everywhere and there's very little formal education that most managers have in organizational change. Okay, I think we've gone through this before. I mean, even HR managers, the OD course in an HR curriculum is an elective. So maybe half the HR managers even take the OD course. Within management and leadership, it's the same way with the organizational change course, in which case it's an elective. And when you get into accounting, marketing, finance, supply, those other areas, they may not even have the organizational behavior course, which is a prerequisite for the change management or OD course. So they're 2 electives away from taking it. But these are all the people that at some point in their career could be managing people and facing these change challenges, which means that they are either forced to observational learning, what they've experienced themselves or seen others do, which oftentimes is more of a bad experience than a positive one, or they're forced into hiring an external consultant if they are not large enough to hire an internal consultant. I mean, how many organizations can hire OD specialists? And even within the companies that can afford to hire one, how many managers could use that expertise that really don't have time, or the OD specialist doesn't have time to service all the needs? So there's an enormous need for some basic competencies. And I'm trying to build in here somewhat of a rethinking, but at the same time, deliver some basic competencies so that they will have some knowledge of the basics, as well as maybe know what they don't know. And at that point, they can go deeper themselves or hire the specific expertise. But
yeah, I think that's great. And I've noticed in my conversations with people on the technical side of operations that perhaps they think they know more about change, or they don't know what they don't know about change.
Yeah, that's right. They don't know what they don't know, because all they have for the most part is observational learning.
Right.
And when you see a change process and you know nothing about it, you get a pretty limited view of what really goes on.
Yeah.
A lot of what goes on is outside their view and outside their understanding. And that's why there's so much resistance in many ways, because they don't understand what's happening.
Yeah.
Okay, jumping back into the table of contents. Right now, I'm shifting around. I'm going to add a know your enemy bureaucracy, talk a little bit more about bureaucracy. So this will be a shift of rethinking about organizations changed, and take a closer look at bureaucracy, the issues there. And then I'm going to get into success stories. In the past, we've dealt with alternate structures, alternate ways of running organizations by company. So we looked at Gore, we looked at Bourgeois, we looked at Hire, we looked at some general constructs such as sociocracy and holacracy. But each of those, it was looking at one organization type or one organization itself, and then looking at how they do things, what issues they run into. I'm going to try to come with this a little bit different and look at it from the basics. What are we learning? So for example, which organizations use distributed decision making. What are some of the issues that arise in doing that? What are some of the trade-offs? I'm going to try to look at the success stories to basically prepare a foundation that everything that follows is really not that new. It's being used here and there. What's somewhat new is looking at the gaps or looking at the similarities and to try to figure out how it all works together. That then lays in the foundation to really talk about the principles themselves. Then after the principles, to flip that around, okay, what does organizational change look like with those principles in place? Let me see what I've got here. I've laid out some of the work here, but I don't have, let me back up, give me a second here. Okay, so for example, I threw the stages of change traditional view in there. I still need to add empowered change, leaders at all levels. I need to add a few more concepts there. This section is light. And what I try to do is, as I think of topics, I'm starting now to create holding spots in the table of contents so I can start moving things around of where things might fit, how the flow in the table of contents might be. Okay, then we get, go ahead.
Oh, I read an interesting conversation about fake empowerment recently, about how, the empowerment movement said, okay, you're empowered now, and telling employees that they're empowered, but nothing changed.
Yeah.
So they still weren't able to take action,
right.
Real empowerment. So that's an interesting conversation.
Yep. There's another extension of that, in that if it is a delegated process, that delegation can be pulled back just as easily as it's given. And to the extent that there's a fear of it being pulled back, there's also a related fear of actually using it because they don't know how much they really have.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, very, very, very difficult issue there. But again, it's easy to say empower somebody. What does that really mean?
Yeah, and to what extent?
Right.
And how do you? Yeah. Exactly. In a bureaucracy, that's really tough.
Yeah, exactly. And that's some of the issues we're going to talk about in different spots here. Okay. And then in getting work done, we're going to look at the functional level, which is the actual network itself. The level 2, then we're splitting into purpose alignment and network weaving. There's a lot of content for both those. We split them into 2 chapters. And then the top side will be the high level governance, the overall direction setting. And then the 10th chapter will be implementing all of this. And then 11 will be basically just the essentials themselves. These would be kind of like the table, the desktop documents that you might want to keep for later reference. This rethinking the people side of organizations, this was just added last Tuesday when Reg and I were talking, and we kind of came to the conclusion that we need to focus a little bit more on this. So I created a chapter for it, but at this point, I don't yet know where that chapter falls. We also don't know whether this is a real standalone chapter or if the concept is distributed across other chapters. So that's kind of a thought holding spot right now, just so that we make sure that the people side is in here somewhere, whether it's a separate chapter that's separate from distributing the ideas, or do we do both? And if we do a separate chapter, where does it best fit in the flow? And again, the flow itself is more of a hyperlink flow in reality, but when you put a table of contents together, certain things have to go into a linear flow by necessity. And so that's kind of an open question right now.
Are you going to address the question of motivation and outdated motivation theories in that section?
Maybe. We haven't got that level of detail.
Okay.
Tell me more. Tell me more you're thinking, because that could be in multiple places. motivate?
Sure. Well, one of the fascinating conversations that Dr. Raj brings up quite a bit is this idea of outdated motivational theories that are behind a lot of, like particularly the performance management systems and organizations. And so I've just been trying to read more about that aspect of what they're based on. So I don't know, that might be interesting for other people to learn about too.
Okay. I'm just going to just throw it in there right now. See if sometimes it's hard to drop it right where I want it.
Or I guess a better question is, what were you guys thinking of including in the people side of organizations?
We hadn't thought about it.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
We just kind of throw it in here for a thought right now. Okay, just as a holding spot, because again, this is in constant flux as ideas come up. So, yeah, I'll just throw it there for a capture. Whether it goes there or someplace else, that's easy enough. But that's what this was the module that I duplicated earlier. I just dragged and placed down there.
Ross, is there a target date to have this completed, or is this kind of a work in progress right now, and there's no?
Oh, it's a work in progress. I've got dozens and dozens and dozens. For example, I've probably got in 3 piles close to 2 feet of paper that's somewhat organized by topics that could be made into different modules at some point. It's just a matter of figuring out how to organize it and periodically sort through it and figure out what needs to be culled and thrown away versus what needs to be organized into a specific concept.
And then once this book is completed, are there going to also be recordings?
The
webinar recordings that I know that you're going to embed some webinar recordings into the book, but I mean, are there going to be new webinar recordings that you'll like package to organizations with the modules? Or
we could do that. Again, I don't know. It depends on how much time we've got and where we get traction. And probably the bigger issue is where we get traction. What I'm finding is that the individual single page concepts are getting a lot of interest.
Okay.
When I post them to Facebook and to LinkedIn, they get many likes, and in many cases also some thoughtful replies and discussion.
Okay.
So they seem to be hitting what we want them to do. The issue of the MP4s for right now, that's just more of a convenience factor of capturing what we've already got and trying to organize it. Part of the challenge that Reg and I have had is we've got too many pieces lying around.
Yeah.
And the pieces are disjointed. And what we're trying to do here is pull the pieces together at the high level by concepts, and then to the extent that there's recordings, associate them under it, and to the extent that there's articles, associate that by chapter, such that it basically becomes almost like a repository of all individual pieces. And then knowing that set of repository, I can then also mix and match for doing other things. So for example, at one point, we thought of doing a regular, like a textbook or a regular book, but it almost got out of hand because the articles were getting too unwieldy. It was difficult making them seamless. Okay. when you read one to the next. Then we said, well, let's go ahead and just do it as an edited collection of articles and we started doing that. And that's in bits and pieces right now. But again, that almost became a great graduate school resource, reference reading, but it really wasn't a good vehicle for the non-grad student, so to speak. I mean, that was some pretty heavy stuff in some of those articles. It makes sense, but again, the average person is not going to read it. They might read the abstract and that's about it, or they might read the abstract and then jump to bits and pieces of it. But they're not going to spend the time to really understand it or understand all the pieces and how the pieces come together. So the individual concept as single pages, that seems to be working out better.
Okay, that's good.
Okay. And let me see what I've got here. I could kind of show through some of the subtopics then. Let's see, we went through the chapter 1 already. Let's see, chapter 2. I don't really have anything other than control and the control of why is control necessary, who's involved, and how is it involved. Okay, and again, when we first got into the issue of control being a barrier to change, it's easy to say, well, let's just get rid of control, but you really can't. Okay, there's certain things that have to be controlled, otherwise you're going to have anarchy and things all over the place, not aligned. So the key then is, how do you do a soft version of control? Let me bring this up then also. Yeah, I've been using hard control and soft control to differentiate the two. Is there another term that might be better to differentiate how control happens within a bureaucracy and how it might happen in a more distributed environment?
I'll think about those terms because I agree. When I hear soft control, I'm not quite sure. I wasn't quite sure what you meant, which isn't necessarily a problem. That just means defining it. But let me think on that.
Yeah, please do, because again, this is a conversation that Reg and I had, because I started using it and he questioned the exact same thing, soft control, but we couldn't come up with an alternative.
Okay.
And within the context, it's understandable.
Yeah.
But the key is, is there a better term that is understandable without having to place it within context, or are we forced then to use the best term that's available and place it within context?
Okay.
Would like rigid control and flexible control, would that explain more of where you're trying to go?
Oh, I think that's part of it, but I'm not sure it's all of it. And that's why I don't want to go to that, because I mean, it's a minor difference. For example, a bureaucracy is rigid, but the control itself is more than rigid. It's how it's wielded. It's how it's expected. And it's built right into the expectations. As you were saying a little bit ago, empowerment didn't work. Well, empowerment didn't work because there's some hard controls hiding in the background that's preventing people's mindset to understand empowerment. And that's more than rigidity. And then the flexibility. And the flexibility is not right either, because it gets into the tension between principles. And that if you place two principles in tension, each principle alone gives you some action orientation, but that action orientation could move away from where you want it to be. So if you put them into tension itself, that kind of holds them together. So for example, distributed decision-making placed in tension with purpose alignment. Okay. So purpose alignment could become very controlling itself, But if you allow distributed decision making, then you kind of move that power away from a central alignment process. But if you do just distributed decision making, then you can have anarchy because everyone's working off their own principles without any type of alignment. So you put them together in tension and you see both parts, but you also understand the tension, and it kind of brings you to a not necessarily an equilibrium, but it kind of brings you to a happy medium that works for both. And that's kind of where we're thinking about, at least in my mind, what soft control is.
Okay.
I guess where I'm coming from is sometimes you might say the hard sciences, the soft sciences, or in leadership, sometimes hard and soft is used there, or management. So it's used in a couple other places within that context.
Okay.
But again, I'm not sure it's exactly right. Okay, and success story, I'm not sure which of these are got populated yet. Okay, I don't have anything populated there yet.
And I was just trying to look to find that to go into this ebook and look at it, because I was trying to remember, when you talk about control, do you go through the different types of control that you articulated?
We're going to, yes. I have not written that, and I'm not sure we've got all of that neatly collected either.
Okay, because that might be helpful to look at it collectively, to start to put together adjectives around. I see where you're coming from with the hard and soft sciences.
Yeah. So for example, you got a lot of times in competencies, the hard competencies, the soft competencies.
Right.
And when you say that, people pretty much have an understanding of why the difference is, even though it's kind of a subtle difference in some cases.
Okay. Right.
And then on principles, designing, okay. Some of this is already done. The designing with principles versus control. This is where I kind of tie into the control again. Principle-based organization design, that's already been done. Okay, that's this one right there. That's where it's kind of pulls in. Then we want to bring in the entrepreneurial mindset, effectuation, and action. And that's going to require probably a couple by the time we get into that. Okay. And then organizational change in the book world. Okay, stages of change, empowerment. Okay. And then I don't have too much yet in these next ones for functional levels. And then implementation, I haven't done that. We've done something on implementation already. We're still working in that with a client now. Summary, I don't have anything in summary yet. Again, the summary is, I'm thinking, what do people need to have on the desktop for frequent reminders of how to pull it all together? They don't need all the details. It's just the key things that brings to mind what they need to know.
Yeah. Well, and as you were talking about that, you just mentioned implementation. Do you have elements of how to put it into practice for each section?
Yeah, we did one webinar last year on how to implement this. One of the recent discussions that I started was on the points of leverage.
Yeah.
That's part of it here. And also that comes from work with a client right now. Okay. And again, when you take a look at most of the successful alternate designs, they are either one of two areas how they got started. One is, well, I guess one of three. They're very small organizations. So for example, sociocracy and holacracy have oftentimes been put into a small organization, in which case there's a reasonable number of people, generally 20 to 50, that all agree upon a new way of working together, and they adopt holacracy or sociocracy. Okay, and that's kind of a small group adoption. Those are generally in the nonprofit arena, but again, in all cases, or almost all cases, small organizations. Then you've got the startups. So for example, Gore, when Gore and his wife organized W.L. Gore and Company around the Gore-Tex product, they had in mind a way of operating that they articulated as a set of principles. So they started their company based upon those principles, and they continue to run the company on those principles. Bergeog is kind of the same way. When they started up, they had a brief period of bureaucracy, realized that wasn't going to work, so they came up with a decentralized model, and they built it from there. But then when you get into Nucor and Hire, both of those cases were mature organizations that were into a crisis. Now, Nucor is fairly new, but still, it was a major crisis of how to compete, how to continue to compete. So they basically developed a way of operating basically as a response for survival in the area of Hire. They were a third-rate manufacturer of appliances. Okay. More of their appliances that they were selling were defective than those that were capable of operating as designed. They would have a tremendous problem on repairs. Like I said, even many of the things that came off the assembly line and passed quality controls weren't operational. Okay. So they were basically given a mandate by the government to either fix what they were doing or they were being forced out of business. So that was basically a survival technique. Okay, without that, Hire would have gone out of business long ago. But as it is, they came with a response for survival and were very successful ever since. Okay. But none of those fits an organization that has been successful in the past and is moderately successful today, but worried about being successful in the future. Okay. So the question is, do you figure out how to change them through the problems they're having now? Or do you wait to the point where they have a near-death experience and are forced to change later? And oftentimes that may be too late or be difficult to make the type of change without a really strong visionary leader. So for example, Hire did it with a strong visionary leader. Without that one person who was actually put in there by the government to fix it, without that one person, the success story of Hire would never have happened. Okay. So in the case we're dealing with now with a very large organization, they've been very successful, but the industry is changing, the customer expectations are changing, and they see some major problems on the horizon. And the people that are basically mid to low level don't understand it, but the upper people are starting to get very worried and are starting to try to figure out how to turn the situation around before they're forced into a really bad position. And you could see the bad position as a potential. Okay, so for example, they are a multi-country subsidiary of a global organization, and their customers are complaining not only to them, but to the parent organization. So this subsidiary is getting pressure from their customers as well as pressure from the parent organization to fix things. And the way they've been doing business just no longer works. The mental models that people have just don't work. So it gets into implementation, and where do you start? Okay. You have to have starting someplace, and this is probably where I want to be getting into the CMI discussion. The place where this organization started was a customer focus. It's easy to say customer focus, but how do you do it? So a lot of time up front was focused on, what is the customer voice? How do you get that customer voice? How do people understand it? And then closely behind that was a parallel effort on purpose alignment. And that it was a matrix organization, and purpose alignment was getting lost in the matrix. So it's basically how to pull purpose alignment out as a specific function. So we're coming at it from two perspectives. One is a customer focus, the other is purpose alignment. And both of those are basically points of leverage that people understand without getting into the bigger issue. They don't understand the bigger potentials of how to organize differently, but they can understand customer focus and alignment. But then as that goes forward, the bits and pieces are put in place such that they start to then actually think different and behave different in how they approach the organization structure and decision-making process. But you have to start somewhere. So that's kind of the first discussion I threw out there, just to see what we might be missing for how to change as a point of leverage. Because you can't just go in and just say, I'm going to change everything. You have to start small.
Right. And that was one thing that I was thinking as you were talking is, do you have some sort of assessment or root cause analysis or anything to guide people to, I'm almost visualizing like a checklist to see what pieces of this they already have in place that's working, and where, and that's part of, I would think it could be individualized, but something of conceptual work to say, okay, well, we have, like an inventory of this is what we have already in place, and this is where we need to go.
I think that's almost too prescriptive up front.
Okay. So really it's finding, because correct me if I'm wrong, what you described for the leverages is really finding their pain, right? So what?
It's fine. It's fine. It's not only finding their pain, but finding a vehicle to address it. Okay. And again, this is another question that's going to come up, and Reg and I have talked about it, and there's been some other discussions about it, and that is the Trojan Horse.
Okay.
Now, the Trojan Horse fits in some ways, but it doesn't fit in other ways. So, for example, the Trojan Horse is something that people accept, and by accepting it, it causes change. Now, where it doesn't fit well is that the change is the enemy within. Okay, so I mean, the change really wasn't wanted per se, but on the surface, it's kind of what we want is, how do you put something in place that starts a cascade of other issues? Okay, so for example, if the outside surface of the Trojan Horse is customer service, okay, no one's going to argue about a customer focus, particularly when there's a lot of evidence of customer complaints.
Yeah.
So basically, you're able to put something on the table for discussion that is not controversial. Now, the responses to that may be controversial, but again, the whole area here is to open up the inquiry and get people to start to talk about it. I'm a little hesitant to do the checklist because you don't necessarily want to prescribe items to them. You need to have them discover it themselves.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I guess, so that would, and I'm sure that more experienced consultants would have that skill set, but I'm wondering if that would be something that you could outline for how to do this.
Well, that's another piece we've talked about but haven't done.
Okay.
And that is how to scale this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and what would that look like? And I'm sure it'd be different for depending on the context and the company and the people that are involved.
This is where we'd almost like to have the change competency group activated.
Yeah.
Because it fits in the same area of, if you've got a body of knowledge that you want people to understand, but they have to kind of discover and learn how to use it. The key then is, how do you set this up that can be easily facilitated? See, again, we can't have experts teaching it because there's not enough experts to go around. Same as there's not enough of change consultants go around. But how can you put together a facilitator guide to allow one of the team members to basically go through the guide, present the guide, and raise awareness, the education process itself. We're thinking about that as a need. We haven't yet thought enough about how to articulate that as a project. But at some point, I'd like to see the Change Competency Working Group address that, because that could be used on many types of new knowledge discovery.
Absolutely. And I think that would answer the how question that people, that seems to come up quite a bit in different discussions about Futocracy is, okay, we have the knowledge, how do we do this?
Yeah.
You know, so
Right.
I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, and that's part of it. There's other parts in there of a lot of the soft leadership skills people talk about as being needed. There's really no training program for them other than experience. And there's some real concern now that as more and more of the younger generation is working online, virtual, they are very focused on a specific task. They lack relationship building with a larger workforce other than those they have direct relationship with, and that they are really not getting the learning experiences that others have had before them. Now, that's not an immediate problem, but in 5 to 10 years, it will be a problem, because they'll be moving up into management positions with more responsibility, and they're not going to have those experiences that's necessary to build those soft skills. And they're going to end up making the same mistakes, but they make them at a bigger scale.
And are you thinking of the hybrid, the virtual?
Yeah, exactly.
Organizational structures. Yeah. That is a challenge, and it brings in new competencies too of how to utilize those soft skills.
Right. Yeah. That's a major problem that a lot of organizations haven't thought through, because they've been dealing with the immediacy of the pandemic, and now they're dealing with the immediacy of where do people work. They haven't yet got into the relationship development, the strategy building over time, the interaction of people for the collaboration. I mean, there's an awful lot of things that are missing. So, for example, even a very flat organization, if you treat it as a traditional mindset with a larger scale for controlling people, okay, and you don't give any more authority down into the organization, you just give direction over more people, okay, you really haven't accomplished anything other than creating a problem, because you've got fewer number of people that are in critical position, and they become even more vulnerable because there's so few of them, and you still don't have a pipeline for developing a backfill or succession. So if you've got a structure where the labor scaling is 1 manager to 5 people, okay, that gives a lot of managers, in which case if one were to drop out, you just combine 2 areas, so it becomes 1 to 10. It's not that critical. But if you got an organization that's say like 1 to 300, okay, and you lose that one critical person, and you don't have anyone in the 300 trained up because it's too big of a jump. Okay. That's one of the advantages of a traditional hierarchy, in that you've got small jumps for development. In a flat organization, you've got big jumps in development if you think about it as a traditional organization. However, if you build them into self-managing teams, then you're building a rotating leadership model or a shared leadership model where people are building some competencies at the lower levels that can then enable them to fulfill higher levels of authority in a traditional but flat organization.
Well, and two, with the self-managing teams, I think what is exciting is they can explore what competencies they want to improve upon. So they could set their own developmental goals.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, but again, that's assuming that when you go to a flat organization, you build a teaming arrangement in, versus a more standardized machine-like orientation where everyone does a very limited function, but they keep doing it so they don't require a lot of direction.
Okay.
So, I mean, you got to manage a lot of people if everyone does exactly the same thing, and all you have to do is train new people to come in to do a very narrow job, or you deal with the problems as they arise. It's very different versus having a dynamic, changing workflow, in which case one person cannot manage that. There's too many decisions to be made.
Yeah.
Okay. That's some of the challenges that I think a lot of organizations haven't really conceptually even thought about going forward, because they're too focused on fighting the fires.
That makes sense. Well, in the first scenario almost sounds like these automated warehouses, with the robots.
No, exactly. Yeah. In which case, in an Amazon warehouse, the people are almost a part of the machine.
Yeah.
Okay. They're doing what the machine has not yet been taught to do. Okay. But again, it's very narrow focused, and they're almost thought about, like I said, as a machine part. And I think to that extent, that's why they're being unionized.
Right.
Which goes back to the old reasons for unionizations 100 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. And what's fascinating is that system is set up for mediocrity, and it also ensures that an organization isn't going to change, as much as a dynamic organization, and also limits innovation.
Yeah, because again, I mean, the average warehouse employee, they are directed, but they're not directed by a manager. They're directed by the computer telling them what to do.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's, I think, why there's somewhat of a rebellion, because all they've got is work rules and pay to fight. They've been taken out of the equation for decision making.
Yeah, and that would be frustrating. That would definitely take away any spark.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's why they have such high turnover.
Yeah.
It's a morale killer.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I have a feeling that this is going to become more and more of a discussion.
I think so. Now, what's interesting is, if you take a look at recent utilization, it's getting a lot of press. It's Amazon and Starbucks.
Yeah.
Okay. But again, is it really a traditional unionization issue, or is it the start of a bigger movement of expectations of a different type of workforce, a workplace?
That is fascinating. I think I've mentioned this before. My dad was a union guy. I think you both know. And so we've had that conversation in our house. And even for salary, if you expect people to work 80 hours a week, and
Right.
they're getting paid less on the hour,
Right.
and they start to feel like they have less autonomy and
Right.
flexibility, and especially if they're starting, being monitored at home, like some of the cases we saw during the pandemic,
Mhm.
then people will start to think unions sound pretty good.
Right. Yeah. But again, they don't really want unions. It's just that they have no other alternative.
Right.
And this gets down to the Humanocracy book. I think we talked about this before. When Hamill and Tsunami put the book together, there's a section that talked about the need for a new social movement. And they placed it within the framework of the union movement, the civil rights movement, and the women's suffrage movement. All three of those were large-scale grassroots in the street movements. And they were saying that the human component in organizations needs something similar, but nowhere do you see that in the streets. You hear a lot about it around the edges, but I'm beginning to think that, okay, what is the street nowadays? Well, the street isn't necessarily the physical street, it's now the internet communication. Are we now starting to see the beginnings of discontent that's being reflected in unionization? That's really not a union movement per se, but a new movement that is being placed as a union movement because the new social movement has not yet been identified as such. That's something I don't know, but again, they kind of leave that in the book as an open issue of something that they see on the horizon, but they didn't say how it was going to come about.
Well, I think you're right about it being more online now rather than in the streets. Because I read an article the other day about somebody who went to a job interview, and the job interview was nothing like what they were told. The salary was all different, and the recruiter was telling them, well, we just say that salary to get people to apply for the job, and this is really how it is. And so the guy, they said that this was posted on Reddit. I can't remember where I read it, but it was on Reddit, and Reddit seems to be a big forum for that.
Right.
Because I see stuff come up all the time about all these Apple employees that are quitting their jobs rather than go back into the office. And
and again, okay, it's not just a physical where do you work, but it's how do you work, the environment itself, and how you're treated.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of things that are just beneath the surface that haven't yet been identified and is being placed in as a great resignation, or is being placed as a union movement when there's really something deeper going on.
Yeah. That makes sense. And it sounds like people are starting to gain awareness of their power for that, of, I don't want to deal with this, so I'm going to go somewhere else. Right.
Yeah. And again, though, it's a lot of people voting with their feet, but it's not. It's not yet been. It's not been organized as a separate construct or a topic.
Right.
Now, other than you've got a few authors that have been writing about this for years. I mean, the issue of humanocracy is not a new concept, but it keeps coming up, and it hasn't yet hit a tipping point of being recognized as a true movement, though there are some evidences of it starting here and there.
What do you think about the human-based leadership movement? Do you think that's tied in? I see, I follow Bob Chapman, and he talks about treating employees as if they were in his care and as human beings. And do you think that is part of the voice that's starting to emerge?
That's part of it. But again, I mean, that's almost synonymous with humanocracy and what that term has come to mean.
Yeah.
So again, a number of people are starting to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
The common terminology is not yet there.
Right.
The centralized leaders aren't there. But again, within an internet environment, is there a common leader point? So, for example, a common leader point of someone leading a march in the street, that's very much an industrial era model.
Yeah.
Okay. In which
Right.
case, what does that look like in an internet world?
Well, I think of, Reddit. Years ago, I stumbled upon a Reddit thread that was Starbucks employees, and
Okay.
they were just complaining about their work conditions, about, all of this. So I think that very well could stand as a almost, but I'm not sure how they would take it to the streets, although it did turn into unionization conversations.
It turned into unionization, but again, a lot of what they're complaining about, they could have easily have solved themselves too.
Mm.
Because a lot of it was the scheduling.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge issue of scheduling there. Well, turn the scheduling over to the people.
Yeah.
Say we need to be open so many hours, or how many hours should we be open? How many people do we need to run this operation? How do you do the scheduling such that the people that get their hours that they want get them? Do we have everyone running the same hours, or do we have a mix of full-time, part-time? What's that look like?
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to do the pay different, okay, let's take a look at the number of people you're staffing versus the revenue we're making. You're basically presenting them the challenge to fit their desires within the constraints that they have.
Right.
Well, that doesn't require a manager to do.
Right. And I did read some of it as us versus them, kind of the big bureaucracy against us, kind of the control, some of, everything that you're talking about feeling like their voices weren't heard. And they, like the company wouldn't protect them. The company was just out for profits, dealing with difficult customers and not having the company's back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In which case, open up for transparency. Come up with a better solution given the constraints. And again, this is where management doesn't have to come up with all the answers. And to the extent that they try, they basically create a divide between them and the workers that's now leading to unionization.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not a new problem.
It isn't, and that's what's fascinating is the situation keeps happening over and over again.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But again, even in humanocracy, they lay out a lot of good ideas, but it's all disjointed. So what Reg and I are trying to do is figure out how to make it a little more seamless so that it fits together. Because like in their book, they deal with all the different things that individuals can do themselves, but it's really disjointed because they talk earlier about the principles, but they don't then pull all these test things under the principles that it fits together. Okay, we're past our hour today, and I've got some other things to do. Is there anything else either you have that you want to put on the table today?
Nope, not for me. I won't be able to attend next week.
Okay.
So you know.
Okay, just I appreciate it. Let me know, but as you can make it, that'd be fine.
Okay.
Okay, and Jen, if you would get me that template, I'd be good to go on creating the first pass.
Okay. I just have to get it from headquarters. And then no, thank you. Fascinating stuff. I think it looks great. I'm excited to see, your progress on it. So
okay, great. I appreciate your feedback and have a good week.
You too.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.